Welcome back. You're watching Newsx. My name is Vineet Malhotra. In 2004, in a videotaped message to American citizens, Osama bin Laden justified the 9/11 terror attacks, calling it a response to the oppression in Palestine and Lebanon. 3,000 people were killed when the four men sent by Osama bin Laden crashed a plane into the World Trade Center. In 2011, the United States conducted Operation Neptune Spear and killed Osama bin Laden. Where they did is yet to know for everyone. Abbottabad in Pakistan. The woman on your screens is Afia Siddiqui, also known as Lady Al-Qaeda. She has been jailed for attempting to murder an FBI agent in Afghanistan. Afia, too, is a Pakistani neuroscientist. While the Trump administration, in its strongest terms, condemned the Pahalgam terror attack, it has not held Pakistan accountable for it. Now, Shashi Tharoor-led delegation is all set to visit United States to take forward India's policy of zero tolerance against terror. Joining us to talk more about this is Spencer Critchley, Democratic communication strategist. Spencer, appreciate you being here with us. How do you see India's efforts to send delegations to 32 countries to seek unity against terrorism, a common problem?
Well, I think in general, I am supportive of that kind of effort, whether it originates in India or anywhere else. My concern about such efforts is that it depends on what the motivations are behind the effort. And sometimes that tends to discredit what I think is a goal anybody should be able to get behind, which is to oppose and reduce terrorism. I think that in the current conflicts that India is involved in some cases there are clear examples of terrorism. For example, the recent attack in Kashmir, when it's, of course, entirely right to resist such attacks and to unite with other countries against them. However, I'm concerned that the Indian government, like the Pakistani government, like the government of US President Donald Trump, like Vladimir Putin's government, like many governments, what they call terrorism sometimes is not really terrorism. It's just something that they see as a threat to their power.
Well, India has been piloting a UN resolution to define terrorism. Do you think that it's time to then do that in order to tackle renewed threats and challenges?
I think there's already a widely accepted definition of terrorism at the UN and around the world. And in short, that's the deliberate targeting of civilians to advance your political objectives. So I don't think terrorism needs to be redefined. And I think this is part of the problem that I identify. We already have a clear definition of what terrorism is, but you find people claiming that it's ambiguous somehow. So, in the case of the Middle East, for example, if you support Palestinian resistance, you'll make excuses for Hamas terrorism. And if you support Israel's right to defend itself, you might make excuses for what the Israeli government is doing in Gaza right now. In both cases, I think those meet the widely accepted definition of terrorism. And I don't think one's nationalist loyalties should change the definition of a word.
Well, India also wants a united front against states sponsoring proxies and terrorism. Why can't we hold states like Pakistan accountable, according to you?
I think we should. And I think Pakistan has a bad record in this area. And certainly the United States has direct and extremely painful experience with this going back to 9/11 and before. Again, my only skepticism here is which countries get singled out and which ones don't. And I'm not suggesting that all countries are equally guilty of this, but many countries are, and they will often claim to be pursuing a righteous campaign against terrorism, but it also seems to be designed to serve their particular national objectives. This is what the United Nations is supposed to be for. Unfortunately, it has failed so many times in its history that it's lost a great deal of credibility on this issue. But that's, of course, the logic behind the United Nations is it's supposed to be a forum where hopefully the nations of the world can rise above just fighting over their national interests, which is endless zero-sum game that just creates the kind of conflict and suffering we've seen throughout human history. Hopefully, at some point, the world can unite to make a more effective United Nations, at which discussions of terrorism and actions against terrorism would have more credibility. But unfortunately, you know, as we've seen, the Security Council is notorious for this. Multiple countries on the Security Council have spoken out forcefully against terrorism when it suits their interests, and then pretended it doesn't exist or defined it as something else when it does suit their interests.
Well, throughout the current operation, India maintained that it conducted strikes on known Pakistani terror camps. Did the United States understand India's stand after that?
I think so. And of course, the United States has conducted such attacks many times in the past, including very recently against the Houthis, for example. And this has happened under administrations of both parties. Again, though, you know, I can't emphasize enough how important it is, I think, not just for the world in general, but for the self-interest of each individual nation to ensure that there's an international forum for this that is credible. Because at the moment, for example, with the recent attacks that India has suffered, it's very difficult for the outside world to know who to trust, even if you feel affectionately towards India, or if perhaps you lean more towards Pakistan, because it's the governments themselves that are providing the information, and there's very little independent journalism that people have faith in that lets people from around the world try to get a sense of what's actually happening, whether it's critical to one side or the other, whether it supports their claims or not. But if we're going to live in a world where everybody just promotes their self-centered version of reality, and heaven knows the United States under Donald Trump is very guilty of this, then none of us knows who to trust, and it just guarantees generations more of conflict of the kind that has plagued human history and from which we were beginning to emerge following World War II with the establishment and growth of the United Nations and an emerging consensus that international cooperation was far better for everybody's self-interest as well as the collective interest of the globe.
Well, if the Pakistan Defense Minister accepts in interviews that they have harbored terrorists, why can't Pakistan be pulled up for being a state sponsor to terrorists?
I think there should be more accountability, and I think that Pakistan has been playing multiple sides of international conflicts for a long time and has harbored terrorists. I mean, again, with the United States, when we finally caught up with bin Laden, he was living in a huge compound in Pakistan, and it's hard to imagine that that kind of thing can happen without the Pakistani government knowing, and that's only one of many instances of that. But I want to be careful here. As much as I oppose the recent attacks in India in the strongest possible terms, I don't want to single out Pakistan as the only country at fault for this kind of activity. So yes, they should be held accountable, but so should any country that trades with terrorists, supports terrorists, and collaborates with terrorists.
Spencer, appreciate you taking out the time and speaking with us. Thank you so much. All right, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee is also with us on the program. Ambassador Mukherjee, you heard Spencer over there. This is obviously, you know, a game of perception as well. The Americans, as you have just noticed, don't see Pakistan the way India sees it. You know, they perhaps think that just Osama bin Laden being found over there is not enough proof to nail Pakistan and its connection and its support to terrorism. But we are pretty close to Pakistan. You know, we share a border with Pakistan, thousands of kilometers. We understand what this country is all about. We understand their pathology. We understand their modus operandi as well. What do you make of you know, what Spencer said, ma'am? And secondly, let's also talk about our outreach in the United States. Is it going to have any effect on the way Americans have dealt with Pakistan?
Well, I couldn't see my co-panelist, but I heard him carefully. It would appear that he is not an admirer of the American President Donald Trump. But he is also not aware that there is no UN recognized definition of terrorism. So when he said twice that there is a widely accepted definition of terrorism, in all the decades of the United Nations, it has not been possible to find an accepted definition of terrorism because of the problem of who is a terrorist and who is a freedom fighter. And this was particularly so when 2/4 of the world was under colonial rule. Secondly, our American guest seems to ignore or sideline the fact that for the United States, regardless of which administration it is, Trump or anyone else, international law exists according to what is good for America's national interests and the rest. In other words, the United States looks at the world through two kinds of glasses. One, when their national interests are concerned, then it's completely kosher to go after Osama bin Laden, find him in a compound, not inform the host country, that is Pakistan, that they're going to go in and kill him, and then to say that that is fine, that is the way America defines its national interest, going after terrorists, which is something which we fully understand. But if India, after an attack in Pahalgam, which our American guests seem to be somewhat reluctant to define as a terrorist attack, but we had 26 civilians who were first asked to strip to check their religion and then killed or executed in cold blood in front of their nearest and dearest. If that is not a chilling terrorist attack, just like 9/11, then I don't know what the Americans would like to define as a terrorist attack. Secondly, when we went after the terrorist hideouts and took them out, our American guest says that it's difficult for him to understand or Americans to understand because there is no independent reporting. But there is huge independent reporting. There are conflicting reports in India. It's a vibrant democracy. There are people who are saying this is the narrative coming from Pakistan. Is it correct or is it wrong? Then there are others who are explaining that the narrative from Pakistan is wrong. So I think that probably our American guest possibly thinks that India and Pakistan are very similar countries. He's hyphenating India and Pakistan. He thinks that because Pakistan has no free press, India has no free press. He thinks that because Pakistan is completely controlled by a man who's been made field marshal because he claims that he has won the war which he has lost, so India should be the same. So I'm very sorry, Vineet, but if our American guest represents standard American public opinion, cutting across America's political divide, Democrats and Republicans, then it doesn't speak well either for the India-US strategic partnership, or nor does it speak well for our desire to be in a world order led by United States. Because if we are to be in such a world order, we would have to be an inferior partner and accept that international law is one way for the Americans and the other way for us. And I think as a respectable country of 1.4 billion people, the world's largest democracy, we are not prepared to accept that. So the Americans, I'm very sorry, will have to change the way they think. That is possibly difficult because from President Trump's announcements, where he keeps saying that India and Pakistan have fought for 1,000 years, I have to come to the conclusion that neither history nor geography is taught in schools in the United States. Because I cannot imagine an American president, the world's most powerful country, does not know that Pakistan was created in 1947 and that we have not been fighting for 1,000 years. So if that's an indication of the worldview of Americans, I'm sorry, Vineet, then we have to have a lot of serious thinking to do on what kind of countries we should depend upon to be our reliable strategic partners. Vineet.
Mukherjee, appreciate you joining us, ma'am. Thank you so much for your thoughts. All right, at this point in time, Joe Adams-George, research lead, Islamist Threats, Middle East Forum, is joining us on the program. Appreciate you joining us. How do you see India's efforts to send delegations to 32 countries to seek unity against terrorism?
I think this is an ambitious plan on India's part for a diplomatic push
following the events in Pahalgam. India has had enough over the years and decades. India has been a victim of Pakistan-funded, Pakistan-supported terror groups that reside in Canada, in Pakistan, and leave devastating attacks in India. And especially what happened in Mumbai in 2008, or the ones against the Indian Army a few years ago. So India's had enough, and I think that also shows a shift in their doctrine as well. So um, India has made it very clear to the West and to other countries, especially in the United Nations, who are part of the UN Security Council, that the next time Pakistan does something, pulls a stunt like this, they're definitely going to face the music.
Well, India has made it clear that any terror attack in the country will be an act of war. How do you see this doctrine change?
This is a significant toughening of India's counterterrorism doctrine, a formal shift in India's rules of engagement when it's drawing, and it's also drawing a clear red line on Pakistan-based terror groups. Um, you can see that this is also a doctrine that is similar to what Israel is deploying when it comes to dealing with a terror group like Hamas. If you see following the events of the October 7, 2023 attacks in Israel by Hamas, where you had Hamas terrorists walk into Israel and go on a killing rampage and take hostages. And as a consequence, Israel has been in war against Hamas for about a year and a half now. So um, this is something that you can see the similar doctrine, being deployed by India, where I expect the next time Pakistan goes about something similar, they could face, and of course, India's essentially put Pakistan in the same bucket as Hamas. So, it's a state, even though it's a state actor, India sees Pakistan no differently from.
Well, India has been piloting a UN resolution to define terrorism. Do you think that it's time to then do that in order to tackle renewed threats and challenges that we have?
As far as the United Nations goes, I am not convinced about the role that the UN could play. The UN is broadly weakened and it has remained significant from a from a global security perspective over the decades. You can see even in the context of the October 7 attacks in Israel, and when it comes to the Middle East conflict, or even between Russia and Ukraine, the UN has been largely ignored and has remained in the background. In fact, if anything, the UN has been found to be a perpetrator in itself, or to have aided in and abetted terrorism. Its own agency, the UNRWA, which, as you know, is a Palestinian refugee agency, the funds that UNRWA got from the global community was used to radicalize Palestinian children to hate Israel. So you are seeing the UN. I'm not sure about India's objectives as far as the UN goes, or even for the matter, the UN Security Council. I think, it could help. It would be largely very cosmetic, but I don't expect anything effective to come through from engaging with the UN.
Well, India also wants a united front against state sponsoring proxies and terrorism. Do you think that the UN can and needs to officially identify these states, including Pakistan?
Again, that goes back to my previous question. While indeed it's time to recognize state actors like Pakistan and Iran, it's the UN has done very little on that front. So, which is why you are seeing a lot of these state actors get away with their actions. So, um, like I said, and this in itself is a sign that the UN has been largely ineffective in in managing global security. It has largely remained in the domain of the countries which have prioritized national security. So, if India, I think India would be better placed in prioritizing the national security policies within itself, looking at bilateral or multilateral cooperations with other like-minded countries who face similar threats of terrorism, rather than engaging with the United Nations. But yes, to answer your question, does the UN need to recognize the role that state-sponsored terrorism plays? Absolutely. It's time to, bring down the hammer on these state actors, and also ensure that any kind of terror financing is made unacceptable.
And how do we make the FATF response against terror funding states a lot more strong than it already is?
Right. Now, of course, as you know, terrorism has evolved over the years. It's shifted from large scale organized attacks to more decentralized attacks, often wherein you're seeing radicalized youth, mostly radicalized online and motivated by various ideologies, conduct these attacks. And you are seeing the even terrorism spread, the geographical spread of terrorism has widened. It's not limited to South Asia or the Middle East or Africa. It's moved on into the borders of the US, Canada, the UK, and all across Europe. You've seen a significant spike in terror attacks across Europe since the October 7 attacks in Israel. So, what I expect, would like to see is increased multilateral cooperation by India with other like-minded countries like the US, because everybody faces the same threat. And in my opinion, Islamic extremism is and remains one of the biggest global security threats to all like-minded Western democracies, and also to the likes of India. In fact, even countries like, I would argue, Russia and China are not immune from Islamic extremism, and they will continue to remain targets to groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. Yeah, so yes, increased support, multilateral cooperation is necessary. Exchange of, as you see terrorism evolve, it's time that we understand not just the kinetic aspect of terrorism, wherein you're seeing the use of weapons, but also the use of ideology being covertly pushed through universities, especially in the West. So that needs to be significantly clamped down. And also, again, like I mentioned, terror financing. So it's time to tighten terror financing laws, money laundering laws in countries, to ensure that groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda do not receive funding from so-called Islamic charities in the West.
Well, absolutely. Well, throughout the current operation, India maintained that it conducted strikes on known Pakistani terror camps. Does the United States understand India's stand and perspective?
The Americans certainly recognize the effectiveness of the strikes conducted by India, but you must also understand that given that the global security environment is extremely fragile, you got a multi-war theater happening across the globe, in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, and in the Middle East, Israel is fighting on a seven-front war with Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and Iran, and other groups. So the last thing that the Americans need is a breakout of an all-out war between Pakistan and India, and which could risk, drawing in potentially China as well, though that's unlikely. But and also it expanding into a nuclear war, and that's something that the Americans can't afford to risk, and which makes it which you can see the sense in why the Trump administration pressured the Modi government for a ceasefire, even though I'm sure it was a rather unpopular decision to have one, given that Pakistan has been incessantly targeting India through the decades with using terrorism.
Well, if the Pakistan defense minister accepts in interviews all over the world that they have harbored terrorists, why can't Pakistan be pulled up for being a state sponsor of terrorism?
That's because Pakistan-based terror groups are only targeting India. If and it has an effect. None of the Pakistani terrorists have caused these attacks in the West. But if it was in the US or in Canada or the UK, the response would have been very different. You wouldn't see talks of ceasefire. I'm sure that if Pakistan, a group of Pakistani terrorists blew up a significant public infrastructure in the US or the UK, you would expect the Trump administration or the Starmer government in the UK to be, rather heavy-handed on Pakistan. They wouldn't look for a ceasefire. So you must understand that because this is India that was a victim, the West does not really care. But if this were to happen within their borders, the response would be very different. So we're talking about double standards in the world of terrorism, and that has always been a consistent thread throughout history. So unfortunately, it's time for the West to change the way it views terrorism in other countries, especially allies, when it happens to allies like India.
All right. Thank you so much for those insights and staying with us and giving your perspective on this important issue. We take a short break now. We'll be back.